Hey guys, it's Wojtek, and we're back with another player character tutorial, this time talking about animation states and animation blending. So, as you can see, we're going to introduce this little armed, ready to fight stance that our character is going to go into. We're also going to introduce crouching for our character, and then we're going to combine these two stances together, so he looks like he's ready for a fight while he's crouching. And then lastly, we're going to introduce a little timer mechanic that counts down from this stance and gets us back into idle. So, let's get into it. Alright guys, so before we get started, let's just take a quick look at what animations we're going to be working with in order to create some of these stance-changing scenarios. So I've gone ahead and under the animation locomotion folder, brought in a couple of new animations. So we have our armed idle, and this is just going to represent our character when he's either punched or kicked or manually sort of stepped into an armed, ready to punch state. And then we also have the crouch rifle hip animation, as well as the crouch walk rifle hip animation. And these two guys came in from the Unreal or Epic provided Anim starter pack, which you can get from the marketplace. But in our particular example, what we're going to be doing is, rather than using the whole animation, because you can see, he's supposed to be holding a gun, right where his hands are, we want to steal this bottom half of the animation, because we're, poor indie developers and we can't afford proper assets. So we're going to take half of this animation, and then we're going to slap on the top half of our existing locomotion animations. And just using a little bit of layer or bone layer blending, we're going to be able to create something new and a little bit more applicable to our game where, we don't have a gun, we just have a bunch of fists that we're going to be punching with. So let's go ahead and flip over to Visual Studio and start cutting some code. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to pop open our player anim instance class. And what we want to do is we're going to add a couple of new attributes. So we want to be tracking when the character is quote-unquote in a weapon-ready stance, when he's sort of armed. So we're going to create a boolean for that. And I'm just going to crop this uProperty definition here and paste it in. Oops. So this is going to be bool b is armed. And that way we can reuse this variable for when we do eventually introduce weapons and other forms of mechanics where we deem that the character is armed with something. So we're going to introduce bool is armed, and then we're going to bring in another boolean for is crouching. And again, this is going to let us know, when in our animation state we need to flip around to our crouch animations. And then lastly, I'm going to bring in another boolean for is moving. And with this guy, we simply want to track the velocity of the character. So we're going to need some additional checks in the future where, if our player is standing still, we perform a certain operation. While he's moving, we're going to do something else. So 3 new properties in our animation instance. Nothing too scary so far. So let's go ahead and go into the CPP file and actually implement these guys. So we already have a section here where we're checking who is the owner of this anim instance. In this case, it's our player. So we can simply say, hey, for is crouching, we can just say player character get movement component and is crouching. Now, crouching, falling, swimming, and flying are properties that are already on the movement component, so you don't necessarily need to define your own, player character specific booleans for that. However, if you do need to control those states independent of the movement component, let's say crouching to you is something perhaps that's delayed or has some other operations, feel free to throw in a couple of booleans on your actual character. Okay, so we have crouching. Let's go ahead and now add is armed. And we're going to say player character get, this is going to be is armed. Is armed. And this method doesn't exist yet, so it's going to complain for a little bit until we add it in. And lastly, we say is moving. Now, is moving, we're going to use the player movement component as well for that. And as you can see here, we already have the speed defined. It's already grabbing the velocity. So I'm simply going to grab this parameter, and I'm going to say if this is greater than 0, so if we are actually moving, there is a little bit of velocity applied to us. And again, we could tweak this value if we want it to be a little bit higher. We're going to say, yep, I'm moving, otherwise I am not moving. So we got our two variables, and now we just need to start adding in this guy. So let's go ahead and now go into our player character and start defining this section. So let's go ahead and start adding in our crouch and stance changing definitions. And we're going to go about that by introducing a couple of new methods, a couple of new properties. Specifically, I'm just going to hop down here to the reset combo section, and I'm going to add in a couple of new functions. So we're going to have a crouch start and a crouch end method. And a crouch end. Oops. And these two methods are going to be tied to our crouch button, so when I press it, you know, our character goes down, and immediately when I release it, he stands back up. We're also going to add another method that allows us to manually switch our stance from, you know, idle, not doing anything, to idle and, you know, ready to fight. So I'm going to call this one, let's say arm player. And again, we'll use this in the future for other arming mechanics. So we have those two things, and I'm also going to add another method. And this guy we're going to use to basically say, at the end of my my punch attacks, or perhaps, you know, once a certain time passes based on, you know, different operations that our character is going to have in the game, we're going to reset the stance from, you know, fighting back to idle. So I need a timer handle to trigger that for me. So I'm going to say, you know, after a certain amount of time, trigger this method, and this method will actually then handle the reset functionality for our character stance rather. So I'm going to call this method trigger countdown to idle. And again, we can reuse this in future state management mechanics. So we have a couple of methods that we're going to tie to buttons, and we're going to fill in with a little bit of logic. Now let's go ahead and add in some variables for us to actually manage some of these states. So the first thing we're going to add is a property. Actually, we'll do it right above our methods here. I'll throw it right here. So it's going to be a property that is going to be an integer, and we're going to call this max countdown to idle. And okay, so I already had this guy prepped. Let me just move him up so it's a little bit closer to the other method definitions. And all this one is going to do is just allow us to control through the blueprint how long it takes for that state to be reset from, you know, sort of ready to punch to idle. So there's one of our variables. We also need to add in a couple of privates that are going to represent our state management. So we're going to create a boolean for b is armed, and we're going to add in a timer handle that is going to represent our arm to idle timer handle. And then lastly, we're going to say int_do count down to idle. And we're going to use this variable to basically be our runtime countdown timer, and then we're going to reset it to the max every time we kind of reset our definition. So great. We have our variable definitions, we've got our header, our method definitions, and I'm going to implement these methods. So just bear with me as I stub out these method signatures. Okay, so we have our methods now in place. Crouch start, crouch end, arm player, trigger countdown to idle. And then the only other thing that we're missing, if you recall, I'll player instance, we have this isArm method, so let's go ahead and add that into our player character. And we'll do it right by, isAnimation blended. So it's going to be another ufunction, and it's of type boolean is armed. Oops, bool. Oh, I swear this autocorrect drives me crazy. So, what is isArm going to return? Pretty straightforward. It's going to bring back B is armed. Cool. So this getter is all in place. Our Anim instance is now happy. We can move on with our crouch start, crouch end, and those other method signatures. Which are right here. Okay. So let's go ahead and implement our crouch first because it's pretty easy. Let's just spit out some log statements to make sure we have... let's do warning. I just want to see that these methods are being called at the right points in time. So we're going to do all of these ones here. Okay. So there's our crouch start. Now, crouch is going to be really hard to implement. That's it, folks. The player character already has a number of methods built in for crouching as well as uncrouching. So that is really all you need to implement. Now, if we had our own variable that controlled the crouching state, this is probably where I would set it. But for the sake of our exercise, this is enough. Then off the movement component, you can simply call get as crouching, and you're good to go. So that's crouch. Now, arming of the player. So this is going to have just a little bit more work. First, we're going to flip-flop our state. So if we are armed, then we are simply going to set it to be not armed, and vice versa. So there's our flip-flop. And we also want to say if I'm not armed, if for whatever reason got into the state, we want to go ahead and reset our timer to max countdown. And we also want to clear the timer that we're going to be working with. So I'm going to say get world, get timer manager, and clear timer. So there's our timer being reset if we are no longer in an armed state. Okay. Now let's go ahead and start. Yeah, let's go ahead and now set up our method for this trigger countdown. Man, words are hard today. So, fairly simple. What we're going to do is we're going to subtract 1 from our idle count. We're going to say, is it less than 0? If so, now we can do something. So, armed is going to be set to false. Our countdown to idle is going to be set to the max, and we're going to clear the the timer for this. Now, I'm sure some of you have noticed that this and this are identical pieces of code, and in the near future, we're going to start cleaning this up, compartmentalizing it a little bit more, so we have more flexibility and reusability. But for right now, because I don't necessarily know where I'm going with this just yet, I'm going to keep them separate. So we have our trigger. So we're going to count down every time this is called, and when it hits 0, then we're going to clean all of this stuff up. Now, let's go ahead and prepare the actual binding events for our inputs, just to make sure everything is working. So in our setup player input component method, we're going to add in now a couple of input key definitions. So we're going to do the crouch first, and we're going to say bind action crouch. We're going to pass ourselves as the input parameter. We're going to say on pressed character crouch start. Cool. Now if we grab the we grab the same thing, and we then say released, we can say crouch stop, or sorry, crouch end. So that's going to give us our crouch operations. Now we also want to have another set of input to allow us to switch into our arm stance. So I'm going to call this arm player, and we're going to say on pressed arm player. So we have our input bindings in place, so those are ready to go. Now we need to start figuring out where in our attacks we're actually going to trigger our timers and our various other events. So crouch, let me just go back to that. There's our crouch start. We have the arming of our player. We have our on attack hit, so I think we're going to leave that alone for a little bit. And then we have our attack start and our attack ends, as well as this section here, our attack input, that does a little bit of conditional logic based on strong, light, medium attacks, which montage pieces to play, things like that. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, after our animation montage kicks off, I think I'm okay to set our state for our player to be, armed. So we're just going to double check that we are not armed already, and we're going to say, cool. So we throw a punch, we throw a kick, we're armed. Great. We should be able now to switch our animation states. Now, we also have these guys here, attack start and attack end. And attack end is one of our notifications that our animations trigger when we want our collision boxes to basically disappear. So that seems like a really good spot to trigger our countdown timer to switch our state back to idle. I finished my attack, I either connected or didn't. Either way, I'm done with it. I can now start kind of getting my player ready to go back to idle. So let's create a variable that simply allows us to determine whether or not actually, let's do this. B is countdown active. And we're going to get our timer manager. We're going to say sorry, what were we going to say? We're going to say is timer active, and we're going to pass in our arm timer. Then we're going to say, okay, so if this guy's running, if we've already triggered this counter, what do we want to do? Well, we want to clear it. So this stops it, and then we can just reset it back in place. So you just call clear timer, and now we can say start the timer again. Let me just leave a couple of comments in here. So this is going to be now our countdown to idle equals our max, and then we say get world. Get our timer manager and set timer. We pass in our timer handle. We pass in ourselves as the owner. We then pass in our our method that is going to be triggered every time this timer runs. We then pass in, hey, is this going to have a, actually, sorry, which method signature am I in? Just want to make sure. Flow delay. Here we go. Yeah, so we're going to pass in our rate of 1, and I think we will leave it as that. So there's our method signature for, actually, sorry. We also want to say true for this one. Okay, so we're going to set our timer. It's going to get kicked off whenever we stop our punches. So we have our arm state clearing, we have our input binding now in place, and then lastly we have our crouch states available to us. So let's go ahead and recompile and just make sure everything is still okay. And as usual, through all my yapping, I did make a couple of mistakes, and I always want to make sure you guys are aware of these things. Also, when you're building your project, I had these variables flipped around. I'd had them on the crouch as well, so this is actually the first input parameter. Should have noticed that. So let me change that and just recompile real quick. Screw up number 2. Periods instead of pointer references. So I originally had the arrows here rather than using the dot notation. So again, don't code and talk. It just gets you into trouble. But our project is now recompiled and no more exceptions. So let's now try things out, see how this is actually looking. So we can get rid of this animation now. We're not super interested in it, but let's go ahead and add in a couple of key bindings for our new methods. So let's add in a crouch button, and I'm just going to use C for that. C for crouch. And we're going to also add in arm player, and we're going to use, let's use R for that. R for arm. And then let's see what actually happens. So our punches and kicks still work. As you can see, there is a trigger countdown to idle being called. And we just went back into idle state. So let us write the next log message for that in a second. And then crouch. So as you can see, we are crouching, but our character is moving. So from, sort of a pure programming standpoint, we have all of our stuff in place, and now we can go ahead and start messing around with our blend spaces, with our state machine, and start blending stuff together to make it look a little bit more interesting. So let's stop our game. And I'm going to show you guys just one little thing that I did prior to this, and just so you're aware of it. Where is crouch? Oh, sorry. It's on the player blueprint under character movement. We have can crouch under movement capabilities. And if you don't set this guy, by default it's turned off, just like fly is turned off by default. You want to turn this guy on, because if you don't, our methods are being called, but as you can see, our camera is no longer moving. So, it's an easy little thing to omit. Make sure you throw it on. Ideally, you can also define it as part of your constructor. You know, we can simply say get character movement, can crouch as current state, can ever crouch. You know, we can turn that on. I'm gonna leave it as through the blueprint for right now, but we'll clean that up. And actually, no, while I'm here, let's just add in that log message for our countdown to be just a little bit more interesting. So we're gonna say here, we'll say from int, and we'll just display our countdown to idle. Okay, let's go back to our player character. And now start fleshing out our animation states. Okay, so for our animation states, we're going to go to our animations folder, pop open the player animation, and let's just take a look at our state machine here. Now, if you ever get lost, remember, animation graph starts off here, hop into your state machine, and now we have access to our definitions right here. So, first things first, we need to define a crouch state. So, we're going to say add a new state, and we're going to call this crouch locomotion. And it's going to go one way and the other way. So, in order to get into the state, what do we need to do? Well, we need to say, hey, am I crouching? And to get out of that state, we need to say, is crouching not? So we do the inverse of that. So there's our states, but now we don't have anything to actually play on our crouch state. So let's go back to our locomotion folder, and we're going to create a new blend space. And I'm going to mimic this blend space on the one that comes with our default third-person character mannequin. So if we look at this idle to run 2D blend space, what we have is we have the speed, which is represented by the character's velocity. And we start off at idle, we move to a walk, and then we move to a sprint. Now, we're not going to mess around with going from walk to sprint just yet. We'll work on that in future lessons. Currently, our character is always running at 375. So what we want to do is going back to our locomotion folder, we're going to create a new animation blend space, 1D. We're going to pick our mannequin, and just to show you that again, anytime you add these additional asset packs from the marketplace into your project, you'll notice we now have duplicate mannequin skeletons. And in order for you to use these animations, you actually have to remap it from this skeleton to this skeleton. And I won't get into that, how you do that, but I do have other tutorials that cover that step. It's pretty easy. We have all of the mapping set up because they're both mannequin skeletons, and then you can just transfer the animations over. Check out the other video if you want to learn more about that. Okay, so we have our blend space, and we're going to call this BS crouch locomotion. And similar to our other blend space, let me just bring that back for example. Similar to this one, we are going to create a speed, and we're going to go from 0 to 375. Okay, so there's our horizontal axis. We're going to call this speed. Minimum value at 0, maximum value at 375. We'll leave the number of grid sections 4. And then we can start adding in our animations. So as I said, I already have a couple of guys here. So we have our idle rifle, and then we have our forward walk as well. Now, one thing you may notice, the 375 is going to be the exact same speed for walking as crouching, and we're going to adjust that once we get this working. So let's not worry about it too much for right now. But we have our locomotion state. Oops, where am I? I'm the player. Go back to our animation blueprint. We can now go ahead and bring in that blend space. So there's our crouch locomotion, and it takes in speed as input. Cool. If we compile and now run this state, when we walk around, you see I hit C, and our character drops down. But he's holding on to his imaginary rifle. Doesn't look that great. He's also moving just a little, I think maybe a little too fast for our liking. And we'll tweak that in just a second. I'll show you where that is. So if we go back to our player blueprint, and you go back to the character movement, again, if you look for crouch, you'll notice under the movement walking, right here in this section, we also have a crouch speed walk. So this is our character running around at 600. This is our character running around at 300. So our blend space is set to 375. So why don't I cap this off at 300, and now, oops, our movement is a little bit better. So it's a little bit closer to feeling a little bit more realistic. Now you see there's a little bit of jankiness with his right knee snapping up, and that's just the animation. I can't really do much about that outside of messing around with some keyframes and getting it to line up better. So just bear that in mind. Okay, so we have our crouching. Now let's get rid of this gun bit up top. And how do we do that? Well, we already have in our idle run, we've got this blend space. And this blend space can be, using Control-C, be brought in over here. So, what do we do now? Well, we can layer these guys, but how do we layer them? Well, we already have a couple of these things defined. It's almost like we were planning ahead. So we have layered blend per bone, and this is what we're using to allow our punches to be independent of our running animations. So if we take this node and again copy it into our crouch state, I can now say, hey, take my crouch content, layer it with my walking content, and if you look at this layer setup, you'll notice that we're saying from spine 0, 1 upwards. So we look at our mannequin skeleton. There's spine. So we basically say from this point up, do something. From this point down, do something different. And if we just spit this out into our state machine, let's see what happens. So now, when I run around, nothing. But when I hit C, you'll notice he's moving slower. He's actually crouching. And we're walking, but we're also carrying the gun. So what that tells us is these lines are flipped. So let's do this. Let's just rearrange them a tiny bit, and things should start looking much, much better. So now, when I crouch, there we go. I'm crouching, and I'm walking, but I'm really crouching, and all of a sudden my gun animations are gone. I don't have to deal with them. Now he does walk a little funny, because the speed that the top animation is playing at is a little bit too fast. And again, you have a couple of different ways of dealing with it. You can have different speed variables for playing things at different states, or for sake of our little experimentation, what we can do is we can just simply say float minus float equals a slightly different float, and I'm going to subtract, I don't know, maybe 150 from that. So now I'm, just to make sure I am explaining myself along the way, I'm going to play this animation back at 150 speed. So you see his arms move just a little bit slower. That may even be, that might be too fast. It's coming out 300 minus 150. Yeah, maybe. Okay, let's take a look anyway. So there's a guy. We walk around. Oh no! Again, subtracted from the wrong animation. So he's walking really slow, but then he's doing this little jazz hands move. Let's clean that up. Oh. So there we go. That's a little bit better. Still a little jonky. His spine is a little too straight. Doesn't super line up with the animations, but, you know, for a freebie, so you should be leaning forwards a little bit more because he's on his toes. His center of balance is a little bit off. Again, that's okay. We have a cheap and free crouch animation going, and it's letting us do all this cool stuff. Okay, so crouching is in place. Now let's go ahead and figure out our arm movement. Oh, and the other thing you can play around with, as you'll notice, his top part and his bottom part is a little janky. You can play around with these various properties. So blend depth, for example, the point of origin where the rotation, the blending of the animations happens. You know, like if we were to jack this up to 5, it's a little bit less noticeable. You see that spot on his chest is not as prominent. If we drop it back down to the 2 that we had previously, you see it's a little bit more twisted. There's a little bit of a larger gap kind of in this chest cavity. So let's flip it back to 5, see what that looks like. So not bad. Still a little stiff, but he's just that kind of guy. You know, he's not the most relaxed fella. But there's our crouches. Let's go ahead and flip back to our state machine here and add in a new state. So we're going to call this armed idle. And for this state, the only thing we need to do is say, oops, is armed. And on the way back, we are no longer armed. Okay, and our armed idle is going to play back our armed idle stance. So there we go. I threw a punch, and I get put into our armed idle stance. And you'll notice, there we go. Once our trigger countdown goes to 0, he gets out of that stance. If I hit R, I step into it. If I hit R again, I turn it off. So I can crouch. But now, as you can see, I can't crouch and be armed at the same time. So we're missing some states. Likewise, when I move, I'm armed, but my legs are not moving, so we've got to fix that. Punching and kicking still works because of our how we handle our blendings with the top layer, but we still need to fix up a couple of these things. See, jump doesn't really do anything, but we have this in place. So let me go ahead and recompile the project because I also want to bring in the little countdown numbers so we're not seeing this message, and then we'll go ahead and add in a few more states. Okay, so one recompile later, we now have a slightly nicer timer in the top left-hand corner. So there we go. And at 1, we should go back to our idle state. Good. Oh, and yeah. Our little HUD element for the combo still works. So, fun times. Tick that box. All right, let's go ahead and now for our armed idle, we want to go to a new state called armed locomotion. And we're also going to go back here. And from armed locomotion, we also want to go to a new state called armed crouch locomotion. And from this state, we can go back to this state. And from a crouch state, we can also go back to a unarmed crouch state. And from our armed locomotion, we'll be able to go back to idle. And likewise, from our idle, we'll be able to go back to this. So we can also add in the supporting states. So going from basically moving and being armed to, let's say, crouch and idle and being unarmed. So we can add these cross sections, but we'll leave that for right now. So from idle locomotion, we want to be moving and we want to be armed. So we'll get an AND Boolean. Okay, so if we're moving and we're armed, then we're going to go here. From our armed idle state, if we are moving, we are also going to go here. So we simply need to say is moving. Now from our armed state back to the idle is moving. Not. There we go. And back from this state, we want to say get is armed. Actually, let's be a little lazy. So, moving is armed, we get here, we're moving, we're not moving, and we're not moving, and we're not armed. Now that we're in the armed locomotion state, we want to go to our crouch state. We simply need to say, am I crouching? And likewise, I am not crouching. There's my not Boolean. Oops. Let's reset that. And lastly, from our crouch back to our crouch unarmed. So we are not armed anymore. And here we become armed. Alright, so do we have everything? That, and that, and that. So now we're going to add in these cross sections to make sure our animations flow very, very smoothly. So arm to crouch, we simply need to say, actually, yeah, we'll do it from here. Is crouch is armed. So I'm no longer armed, but I am this other state. Cool. So this is going to get us from here to our crouch state. And you know, let's just double check, make sure everything works before we clean up a few more of these. So we have our arm locomotion. Now, what do we need for this? Well, we want to be able to bring in our armed idle state. So let's bring that over. I'm going to bring that over. And then we also want to be able to have our walking state. So let's bring that over. And now we want to blend the two together. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our layer blend per bone. Oops. And we're going to drop that node in here. And it has my same definitions, my blend depth of 5. I'm going to flip it back to 2. And now let's go ahead and add those in. So if our arm locomotion works correctly, like if we recompile our project here, and we take a look at our guy. So if I'm armed, he goes into my arm stance. Now, if I'm moving and I'm armed, he goes into, oh, I got these upside down again. There we go. So he's standing still, but he's ready to punch. So if we now set our speed to be, let's say, 100, so we're going to say I'm moving. Oh no, and I did have him backwards. Hold on a second. So I'm moving, and my state is moving. Yeah. Maybe I should really increase the speed. There we go. Oh my goodness. So we have our movement now with our top portion blended. And let's go ahead and introduce that same mechanic into our crouch locomotion. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the top bit here, the crouch locomotion. We're going to take our arm idle animation. We're also going to take our layered blend per bone, and we're going to do the same thing. So now, if I'm crouching and I'm moving, my guy's going to zip along. Crouch, up, And there they go. So let's try it out. So there's our running around. This is our locomotion with the armed state. You see our punches still work, and he kind of holds his hands in a guard position before our timer runs out and goes away. And now when we're in our crouch state, we can still punch, and he goes back into his, his guard pose until a timer runs out, and that stance goes away. So we have crouch punching, if you want to hit someone in the dick or, whatever area. We have our top punches for some face punches, our kicks, still block movement, and our full body motion animations, also from a crouch. So if we're crouching. And yeah, and we can manually flip between the armed and the disarmed state. The only thing that's really missing is I'm not triggering the timer when I'm manually flipping these poses. But yeah, there you go, guys. We just went ahead and created a fairly rudimentary, but, kind of a beefy and powerful set of blend spaces that allow us to have a little bit more, fun with our character. And we're going to continue down this path by adding in strafing and various other animations for swimming and jumping and maybe even flying at some point. But for right now, we have this. Oh, look at that. And we found a bug. So if we are armed and standing still, we're not crouching properly. So here I go, trying to shut down the video, and I still have an issue. So let's take a look at our animation graph. And basically from here, we should be able to go to this state and perhaps even this one. So crouch is pretty easy. We basically say is moving, is crouching. We want to ensure we are not moving. We'll get an and boolean going here, but we want to be crouching. And I'm going to take this definition and steal it so we can flip back into this state. So from crouch to idle, we're going to do something very similar, except we're going to take this knot and bring that over. So I'm not crouching. Oh, sorry, I thought I copied that. And non-moving. Then we go back to our armed idle state. So now, bam, I'm armed, and I can crouch, I can punch, and again, I'm sure there's probably a couple of other combinations that I'm not considering, and you can see how these state machines can get quite complex as you add in these various states. So bear that in mind. Try to adjust things as much as you can. Keep it simple. Don't try to kind of overcomplicate stuff. And you know what? Let's just adjust the blend depth on this one because, yeah, his chest cavity has a really large gap on the front. So I think if we just flip this around, and we'll do the same thing for the crouch state. Set it to 5. That's a little better. At least he kind of jiggles side to side. It's a little bit more realistic. Oh, and yeah, we still have this issue. So like I said, I didn't catch all of these states in the one shot. So if we are armed and moving, we can go to jump. Oh, is in air. So we'll go to the jump. And from our idle, we're also going to go to the jump. I'll leave the crouches alone for now. There we go. Now that's better. So we're in our arm stance, we're jumping, and we're still jumping. Okay, and we can't jump when we're crouched. Good. So yeah, there you go, guys. A couple of mistakes along the way, but I'm hoping everyone's learning a little bit of something. So, thank you for tuning in, and I hope to see you next time, when, like I said, we're going to get into some additional movement states for our character.